After returning to Milan, Lipton was serving as first sergeant. There was a hut there with bunks that had been built from rough lumber by a couple of prisoners of war. The bunks were put together in a crisscross fashion so that bedrolls could be laid on them, and the building served as the sergeant's quarters. At some point, we discovered a champagne cellar in the basement of a building. Through the slats, we could see shelves full of champagne, even though the area above was locked. We figured that if we could get into the basement, we could pull the slats loose and reach the bottles. The sergeants managed to get hold of a case and brought it back to the barracks. None of us had ever really drunk champagne before. We poured some into our canteen cups, took a sip, and thought it tasted more like soda than alcohol. Before long, everyone was drinking cup after cup. Soon enough, old grievances surfaced, arguments broke out, and a full-scale brawl followed. I was involved too. Every bunk in the place, and I ended up with nails in my feet and blood running from several cuts. The whole barracks became a battlefield. Lipton eventually came down from his own quarters, furious at the sight of a group of sergeants behaving that way. The next morning, before anyone had recovered, we were told to fall out because we were heading to Bastogne. We protested, expecting passes instead, but the order stood. We climbed into the trucks, still suffering from hangovers, sore feet, and bloody noses. It was quite a sight. They dropped us well outside Bastogne, and we had to march a long distance before reaching the town. Once there, E Company was assigned its position, and that was where we dug in. The fighting was intense. Once again, our platoon sergeant did not end up going into combat, and I found myself acting as platoon sergeant. It seemed to happen every time we entered a major fight. The area was heavily wooded, which created another danger. Artillery shells often exploded in the trees, sending shrapnel straight down into the foxholes. Some men tried cutting down trees and using them as overhead cover, though it was difficult work with the tools available. It was in this area that Garnier was badly wounded, and Walter Gordon was also hit. Walter was struck across the neck by small arms fire and was expected to be paralyzed permanently. Later, after recovering, he was nearly sent to Japan until his father intervened. Walter was a gifted storyteller and earned the nickname Senator Claghorn. Garnier's wounding affected me deeply. When friends are killed or injured, and when you are constantly seeing bloodshed and death around you, life can begin to seem cheap. The interviewer mentioned Webster's reflections on losing comrades and how repeated losses eventually become routine. Replacements arrive, empty bunks are filled, and the cycle continues. He asked whether that constant exposure creates emotional numbness. Looking back, I think what we now call depression was part of it. At the time, you do not recognize it because you are in the middle of a war, but it affects you all the same. Day after day of combat wears a man down. You never truly become accustomed to it. The closer you are to someone, the harder their loss hits you compared to someone from another platoon whom you barely know. Garnier and I had been friends since training days. He used to come home with me on furlough while we were still in the United States. When he lost his leg, I did not learn the full details until later. Initially, all we knew was that he had been severely wounded just above the ankle. The injury might have been salvageable, but Bastogne was still surrounded. He was taken to an aid station, and despite efforts to save the leg, infection developed. Doctors amputated below the knee. Later, another infection forced a second amputation above the knee. It was a terrible progression. I remember him lying on a stretcher in the darkness at Bastogne. He said, "Johnny, I'll see you in the States," already understanding that his war was over. I gave him the cigarettes from my K-rations, even though I'd never smoked and had no intention of starting. He smoked heavily, so I thought he could use them. After the war, Garnier remained a close friend. He even spent part of his honeymoon at my parents' house in Columbus, Ohio. Over the years, we vacationed together in places such as Mexico and South America, and our friendship endured. Thinking back to Bastogne reminds me of Jack Foley. Before the Battle of the Bulge, he had been serving in the Coast Artillery in South Carolina. Because the 101st Airborne needed replacements, he was transferred to Fort Benning, spent about a week there, was flown overseas, and found himself in combat at Bastogne within roughly a month. He joined the 1st Platoon while I was acting platoon sergeant. By then, Patton's forces had reached us, and limited air resupply had resumed. Foley and I dug a foxhole together beneath a tree. About 30 feet away, Muck and Pencala dug what looked like an even better foxhole. That night, German artillery pounded us continuously. 88s crashed around us for hours, By then, I was probably close to being a nervous wreck. Every incoming shell made me tense. Foley even remarked that I seemed to be in bad shape. The next morning, as we prepared to move, I realized Muck and Penkala were nowhere to be seen. Their foxhole had been replaced by a crater in the sandy ground. We started digging and uncovered part of a sleeping bag. A direct artillery hit had landed within 30 feet of where Foley and I had been sheltering, killing both men. For Foley, it was a brutal introduction to combat. The interviewer observed that earlier wars often involved intense but relatively short battles, whereas soldiers in the world wars could remain under constant threat for months. He suggested that every man eventually reaches a breaking point after prolonged exposure to combat. I agreed. Bastogne pushed many of us close to that limit. What frustrated me most was what happened after the siege ended. We survived Christmas, New Year's, the encirclement, and everything else, yet instead of being withdrawn for rest, we were simply given replacements and sent back into action. I had imagined we might at least receive fresh clothing, or some time away from the front, but that was not the case. Soon we were attacking the town of Foy. By then Captain Dyke was in command. As we advanced across an open field, the only cover before reaching the town was a large haystack. The platoon gathered behind it while artillery shells passed overhead toward the German positions. Dyke froze under pressure, and someone had to take action. I ordered Frank Perconte to move behind a tree and fire into the buildings where the Germans were located. He found cover behind a tree that concealed his head but not the rest of him, and he was shot in the buttocks. I then directed a soldier named Webb to another position so he could fire into the town. As the attack continued and the 3rd platoon moved in from another direction, we prepared to advance. I called for Webb to move with us, but he did not respond. Thinking he had fallen asleep, I ran over to him despite the ongoing fire. When I reached him, I discovered he had been shot directly between the eyes. Webb, a quiet young man from New York, had been killed. The interviewer then asked about Lieutenant Peacock. I joked that he probably would have had me court-martialed for insubordination on numerous occasions. During the fighting, he unexpectedly received orders sending him home, which astonished everyone. He had served as my platoon leader for quite some time. Although he was not especially popular with enlisted men, he was not a bad person. The challenge was that in combat, officers were expected to decide what needed to be done. If they failed to do so, someone still had to make decisions, and that responsibility often fell to me. Peacock generally did not interfere with the choices I made. He would simply acknowledge them and move on. One example involved a combat patrol described by Christensen. Winters ordered me to take several men from the 1st platoon on a reconnaissance mission. The instructions were straightforward. Follow a railroad to a designated area and continue until the Germans opened fire, allowing us to determine their position. The patrol included Christensen, Hubler, John Julian, and 2 others. As we moved through a stand of pine trees, we eventually entered an open area that appeared to have been used by loggers. The Germans were dug in there and immediately swept the clearing with machine gun fire. I dove behind a tree barely large enough to protect me. Bullets shredded it, but I escaped unharmed. Christensen found similar cover nearby. Julian was to my right, and he was hit. At that point, we had accomplished our mission and withdrew to regroup near the railroad. During the reorganization, we realized 2 men were missing. I took Christensen and Hubler back into the area to search for them. We could not find either man. Later, we learned that one soldier had circled back directly to the company instead of returning to the rendezvous point. Julian was eventually located after friendly forces advanced through the area. He had been killed by a gunshot wound to the neck. The interviewer added a few clarifications. In the television series, Edward Babe Heffron is depicted as being on the patrol where Julian was killed, although he was not actually present. He and Julian had been close friends after joining the company as replacements. The series also portrays Lieutenant Peacock as abandoning the fight, but Christensen's notes indicate that he remained with the patrol throughout. Another soldier named Webb, Harold Webb, was also killed at Foy. Martin's description makes clear that the Webb killed during the attack was Kenneth Webb, the soldier from New York. Why do you think the series writers made changes to the history that didn't need to be made? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like and subscribe.